God, we thank you for this time. We can gather to worship you. We thank you now for the opportunity to turn to your word, to open our eyes and our ears and our hearts and minds to what you have to say to us through your scriptures. We pray, God, that as we continue to reflect on the story of what you have done in the lives of your people from the beginning and what you're still doing today, that you would give us hearts that receive the message you have for us, that you might use your word, you might use this time to shape us and to form us into your people. It's in the name of your Son, Jesus, that we pray these things. Amen. In August of the year 410, the unthinkable happened. A group of scruffy barbarians, Visigoths from Western Europe, led by a king named Alaric, stormed into the city of Rome, the former capital of the empire that up to that point had been the strongest, most far-reaching, most dominant and influential power that the world had ever seen. But once inside the city walls, it didn't take long for the Visigoth forces to effectively dismantle this once thriving metropolis, so that the symbolic center of Western civilization was dramatically remade at the hands of these foreign invaders. Understandably, the aftermath of this event, the sack of Rome, was a time of great moral and emotional crisis. Among the luminaries of the empire, the old families who had ruled during a time of great achievement and unprecedented grandeur, this invasion was a kind of death knell for everything that they had once held dear. Their visions of Rome as the hope of the world were destroyed when Alaric and his soldiers began to set fire to Rome's buildings, to pillage the homes of Roman citizens, to replace the famed Roman order with a savage chaos. But this event was also supremely upsetting to Christians living in Rome. By this time, in fact, Rome had become officially Christian. Under previous emperors, the Roman Empire had embraced Christianity as the state religion, just a generation earlier. And so many followers of Christ who had grown up with stories of persecution and suffering were hopeful that this new Christian Rome was more than just a safe haven. See, they envisioned Rome, this new Rome, as a fulfillment of God's purposes for the world. After all, here you had the most powerful nation in human history professing to follow Christ. Surely this was what God had in mind all along. Powerful people in powerful places declaring their allegiance to the church. But when that vision came to a crashing halt with the sack of Rome, many of these same Christians were thrown into a tailspin. If Rome, the great hope for the world, had been vulnerable, in what could they place their trust? To make things worse, a number of unbelievers began accusing Christians of bringing this trouble on Rome by forsaking the old gods for their new religion. Unbelievers living outside of Rome, in the places where many Roman Christians fled in exile, mocked these Christians because their God had not been able to save their homeland from destruction. So those early years of the 5th century was a difficult, confusing time for the followers of Jesus. And into this troublesome context stepped one of the great Christian thinkers of the ancient world, really one of the great thinkers of any time in history, Augustine of Hippo. In response to the intensifying anxieties of his fellow Christians, Augustine wrote an enormously long, enormously influential work called The City of God. And in this work, Augustine expounded on all kinds of issues. But at the heart of the work was the idea that God had not abandoned his people just because Rome had fallen. To think this was the case was to equate Rome, which was a human city, with God's kingdom. Rome, Augustine said, was a nation, and all nations will eventually fade away. All nations will eventually crumble into oblivion. But the city of God was far more enduring than that. So Augustine urged his fellow believers to put their trust in something lasting, rather than pinning their hopes on a kingdom that was destined by its very nature to fall. And Augustine's wisdom is still worth listening to, 1,600 years after he shared it. We all have moments, personal, communal, maybe national, these moments that rock us to our core. For some of you, it may have been the bombing of Pearl Harbor when you were young children. For many of us, including myself, it was the attacks of September 11th, 2001. Recent terror attacks in Paris and Brussels and other ISIS targets have also served to wake people up from a kind of slumber and put us on edge. And in these moments, we're forced to reckon with the fact that the things that we thought were stable, maybe even invincible, are actually quite vulnerable. And so often, it's in these moments that God makes his presence known in a mighty way, to remind us of what is truly important. As we read through the story of Scripture, we find that God's Word is full of these sorts of moments. These times when God spoke through his prophets, through miraculous events, through his Spirit, to demonstrate to his people that whatever else might be unfolding all around them, God was still working. God was still working out his plans. God was still working out his purposes. For example, today is the day when the church celebrates and remembers the Feast of Pentecost. This was when a group of Jesus' earliest disciples were gathered in Jerusalem during their own time of transition and confusion. It was a very unstable moment in their lives. It was just days after Jesus had ascended to the Father and left them to carry out his mission in the midst of a hostile world. Yet these believers on the day of Pentecost experienced the coming of the Holy Spirit. This was an event that reminded them that they were not alone. It reminded them that God was still present, that God would use them, as small as they were, as vulnerable as they were, to do great things for a kingdom that was not vulnerable at all. We also see these moments in the Old Testament narratives, including the story that we'll be looking at today. If you've been following along as we've journeyed through the story over the past several weeks, you've probably discerned that the people of God are in a bad way. Following the reign of David, following those early salad days of Solomon's rule, things have taken a turn for the disappointing when it comes to the kings and kingdoms of both the northern and the southern tribes. Idolatry, immorality, military threats, natural calamities, divisiveness, strife. All of these negatives that have accumulated throughout the reigns of such rulers as Jeroboam and Ahab and Ahaziah have turned the north into a kind of spiritual wasteland that retains only the most tenuous connection to the legacy of the covenant. And in the south, things weren't much better. Even good kings like Jehoshaphat and Amaziah were unable to stem the tide of sin for long. So that Abraham's children in both parts of the divided kingdom were heading for a shameful end. The kings were still clinging to their thrones. The economies and military machinery were still running along, even as enemies crouched at their gates. But the die had been cast. The warnings of the prophets were about to come to pass as generations of disobedience were about to blossom into a harvest of consequences. If this were a basketball game, the fans would already be streaming for the exits. The outcome was all but decided. But even here, God was not silent, nor were God's prophets. One prophet in particular, perhaps the greatest of the so-called writing prophets, or witnesses who wrote down their vision for the people to read, Isaiah, son of Amos, preserved in the book that bore his name a recollection that would provide a sense of hope. It would even provide a sense of inspiration for those who were doing little more than waiting for the axe to fall. And so in Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah relates the story of a remarkable encounter with the God of the universe. Let's read a few verses from that chapter together. Isaiah starts off, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory.' At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and the threshold shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. 'Woe to me,' I cried. 'I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty.' Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it, he touched my mouth, and he said, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for." Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" And I said, "Here am I, send me." So this passage begins with some historical context. In the year that King Uzziah died. And with this, Isaiah is telling us not just when the event occurred, but also why it matters. See, Uzziah was one of the good kings, or at least one of the better kings of the southern kingdom. His death for a man of God like Isaiah would have been one more disheartening occurrence in a series of unfortunate events. Tradition holds that Uzziah and Isaiah were cousins. So the grief of Uzziah's death would have been somewhat personal for the prophet. Also, the end of Uzziah's life, which you can read about in the book of 2 Kings or 2 Chronicles, during which he suffered from leprosy. He was forced to live in a separate house from the rest of his family. He was even buried at death outside the sepulchre of the kings. This was a difficult conclusion to the story of a mostly faithful ruler. And so now, as the kingdom teetered on a kind of precipice of destruction, Isaiah, as a prophet, has to reckon with the fact that Judah's king is gone. There's a lot of uncertainty about what his son Jotham will do, or how he will rule. But if the first few words of this chapter locate this event in a time of confusion, in a time of discouragement, a sort of ambiguously troubling historical context, the phrase that follows articulates the message that Isaiah really wants to get across. He says, "I saw the Lord, high and exalted, seated on a throne." The old king Uzziah is dead. Like all earthly rulers, both the good ones and the bad ones, he is, in biblical language, resting with his fathers. But that doesn't mean that the throne, the true throne, is unoccupied. In fact, in the way that Isaiah describes this vision of Yahweh leaves little doubt that the one seated on the throne belongs there. That he won't be going anywhere anytime soon, no matter what the political or military future of Judah and Israel have in store. This is a beautiful moment. Look at the glorious imagery Isaiah uses. He says, the train of his robe filled the temple. The train, the part that gets dragged along behind the robe, was so glorious that for a moment at least it completely arrests Isaiah's attention. Yet we all know that the train of the robe would only pale in comparison to the beauty and the majesty of the robe itself, or certainly of the one wearing that robe. Men, think about your wedding day. Some of your wives may have marched up the aisle of a church, decked out in a lovely dress, with a long train trailing behind. Some of those dresses and some of those trains might have been pretty impressive. Now, if a few days or a few weeks or even a few years after your wedding date, someone were to ask you what the most memorable part of the day was, I'd be willing to bet that not one of you would say, "Let me tell you, when I saw that long train dragging behind my bride's dress, it just took my breath away." That would be kind of ridiculous, right? Your attention wasn't on the train, but on the one wearing it. And so if Isaiah pauses in this brief verse to notice the long train of the Lord's robe filling the temple, it's only as a way of describing God's glory. It's only as a precursor to the real highlight. The angelic choir that hovers just above the Lord further accentuates God's majesty with their song, shaking the doorposts with a litany of praise. Which leads us to the realization that this beautiful moment was also a terrifying moment. The smoke, the noise, the unmistakable presence of the ruler of all creation. All of this overwhelmed Isaiah because he realized that he was unworthy to be there. That because of his sinfulness, because of his impurity, because of his inclination to follow rulers other than this one, to place his trust in lesser realities than his God, he could only tremble in anticipation of the likely destruction that would surely come his way. All Isaiah can think about is covering his head and crying out for mercy from this all-powerful and undeniably holy God. "Woe is me," he declares. It's a cry of holy terror. It's a cry of grief. It's a a cry of confession. I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King. Also, I think it's a cry that puts things in perspective. Suddenly, the kings of Assyria and Babylon, the foreign armies that were licking their chops at the thought of consuming Jerusalem and Samaria, didn't seem so scared. The only thing that concerns Isaiah at this moment is whether this God, seated on his throne, will spare him the punishment and the shame and the guilt that he so surely deserved. And here we see that this king, in all his power, in all his majesty, in all his holy, righteous fire, is different. He's different from the human rulers that had sat on the thrones of Israel and Judah, even the good ones. He's different from all the despots that ruled over other Near Eastern kingdoms with iron fists. He's even different from the pagan deities that ancient people had put their trust in, and he's different from all the false gods we follow today. Because this God, this divine king, despite the fact that all honor and glory and praise is due him, despite the fact that we have so often withheld that which is rightfully his, is also a God of grace. God is mighty, but God is also merciful. And our encounters with him can and will change us for the better. Our unclean lips don't have to stay that way. When we acknowledge our sin, when we confess our grief at the state of our hearts and at the hurtfulness of our actions, God will cleanse us. It might be painful. It certainly would have been painful for Isaiah. That burning coal that the angel would have used to touch his lips would certainly have hurt. But if fire hurts, it also purifies. It makes dirty things clean. And so God, the rightful ruler, the one who sits on his enduring throne, gives his subject, Isaiah, a powerful promise. Your guilt is taken away. Your sin is atoned for. Just after this, Isaiah hears a conversation taking place. God asks a very significant set of questions, perhaps to the angels that were hovering about him. He says, "Whom shall I send? Who will go for us?" Now, Isaiah doesn't know the nature of the mission that God is discussing. Isaiah doesn't know where it will take him or whom he will have to confront. All he knows is that this ruler, whom he has encountered in glory and majesty, whom he has encountered in fear and forgiveness, deserves every last shred of his allegiance. And so he answers this question in eager willingness. "Here am I. Send me." See, Isaiah knew that whatever the call was, he could trust it, because it came from the mouth and from the heart and from the purposes of this ruler he had encountered in the temple. Isaiah's response is not the response of unclean lips. It's not the response of a faltering heart or an anxious spirit. It's the response of one who has been purified and cleansed and remade. It's the response of one who has been given something stable to hold on to in a very unstable world. It's the response of one who understands who is really in charge. And it should be our response as well. While our encounters with God may not appear as dramatic as the one that Isaiah relates here in the book that bears his name, it's important to realize that this is our story too. See, we live in a world very much like Isaiah's. It's a sinful world. It's a scary world. It's a world in which the rulers that we place on the throne, the false gods we worship, the programs and perspectives and plans on which we pin our hopes, will so often let us down. It's a world where our own sinfulness renders us incapable of recognizing who is in charge. It's a world in which our own brokenness prevents us from overcoming our struggles. But into this world, God speaks. God speaks with reminders of his glory and beauty and majesty. He speaks with reminders that even when the world around us seems to be on the verge of falling apart, when the institutions that we thought were invincible get exposed, when the people that we thought were trustworthy fail us, our God is not going anywhere. The creator of this world still holds it and us in his very capable hands. And the Redeemer of the world still sends those who are willing to do his work, those who are willing to fulfill his mission, and those who are willing to bring about his kingdom, the only kingdom that will never fail. Please pray. God, we thank you that you revealed your glory to Isaiah. And we thank you that you reveal your glory to us. But even more than that, Lord, we thank you that with the revelation of your glory also comes the revelation of your mercy. That just at the moment when we realize we are not worthy to be in your presence, we are not worthy to approach your throne, you cleanse us, you heal us, you make us whole, you forgive us, and you make us fit for service. God, we thank you also that you send us, that you consider us to be instruments of your purposes and plans. And so, God, we thank you for who you are and for who you have made us to be. And we pray, God, that as we encounter you in your word, in our lives, in the lives of those around us, we would never cease to cry out along with the angels, holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. We would never cease to rejoice at the fact that even when everything around us might seem to be falling apart or spinning out of control or crumbling, that you are one in whom we can place our enduring trust. You are one who gives us eternal life. We thank you for all these things. In the name of your Son, Jesus.